In this tutorial, I will show you one approach to painting a still life in watercolor. My still life is comprised of simple geometric forms including cubes and a cylinder. I've set up the objects next to a window for unidirectional light so that my objects have a wide range of values, which will make it easier for me to describe these objects on a two-dimensional surface in a semi-naturalistic and illusionistic way. Value refers to relative lightness or darkness. And this exercise is about paying attention to the values you are observing in both the objects and the surrounding space. By focusing in on value and limiting my color to a monochromatic palette, this is good preparation for painting with more complex polychromatic palettes, as it teaches you how to distinguish value from other attributes of color, such as hue and saturation. I've started by making an 8-step value scale using a mixed neutral made from mixing a blue pigment, such as ultramarine, with a brown pigment, such as burnt sienna. This value scale will guide my painting as I relate the values observed to the ones painted in the scale. This preliminary work helps me get my bearings with the image and can help me decide how light or how dark to make certain areas of the painting. First, to establish the values, I'm using a numbering system to diagram the initial contour drawing before applying the washes of paint. In watercolor, I generally work from light to dark. Here you see me using the numbering system first, numbering the scale itself, and then numbering the painting in correspondence with the scale. In this system, 1 is representing the lightest value and 8 is representing the darkest value observed in the still life. 8 is an arbitrary number, as you could simplify the values down to 3 or 4 increments if you wish, or you could increase the increments to 10 or 12 if it makes sense with your subject and what you're observing. Once this step is complete, I can proceed with applying diluted washes of color to my painting. I'm starting with the very lightest values, distributing them wherever I see 1s and 2s. Keeping in mind, I can always darken them later if it seems to make sense. Notice that I am applying the lightest washes in both the objects and in the ground, or the areas surrounding the objects. Next, I am applying washes in more of the middle ranges of values with numbers 3 to 5. Once I'm ready, I can then go ahead and begin blocking in the darker values, as this will help me begin to relate the values in between. As needed, I can remix my neutral if I see I'm running low on paint. Something else you might notice is that before moving my brush from the palette to the paper, I am blotting the brush on a paper towel. This is to cut down on moisture and will allow me more control of the wash that I'm applying to the paper. With too much water on the brush, I risk the paint moving in a more unpredictable way. So blotting cuts down on things like blooms and will allow the paint to be applied in a more flat and, again, controlled way. As I'm doing a value study such as this will help me down the road when I want to work in more complex color palettes. When thinking about value or relative lights and darks, I have to always relate one part of the painting to another as I work. When looking at the edges where 2 planes meet, such as the edge of a cube to the edge of the ground, or the edge of the paper towel roll to the edge of the ground, or a shadow, I must ask the question, which side is lighter, or which shape is lighter, and which is darker? This question guides each step as I decide how light or how dark to make each shape. Whether I'm painting this in the foreground or the background, all shapes are approached with the same idea. If I notice an area that would be stronger if it were lighter, one approach might be to darken the space surrounding it, which gives the illusion of lightening up that shape. So at this point, I have some of the values in the objects, what we'll call the figure, established, and also have been working some of the values in the ground or the background. So in this case, that includes some of the space around the window and also some of the shadows on the, actually it's a brick surface that these objects are sitting on. I've reinforced some of the shadows as the paper is still damp, gradually darkening the area just beneath the object. Since the paper is damp, the color I'm applying can diffuse or spread more evenly within that shape, which allows for a slight tonal gradation that's gradual. As I now have more of the overall values established and I'm feeling a bit more confident in where the values are all going, I'm going to more aggressively block in these middle to dark tones in the background of the surrounding windowsill, as well as the darker areas of the blocks. For the purposes of this exercise, I would encourage going darker than you think you might need to, even exaggerating the overall value contrast within the image. You can really learn a lot from this exaggeration, and as you paint more and get more comfortable with painting value relationships, you'll have more skill in controlling the values in a narrower range of tone and will be able to create more subtle shifts between the values of within objects and their background. You can notice too that as I'm painting, sometimes I'll do a little swatch of the color next to the value on the scale that I think where I'm at. So I can do a comparison, and I'll even do a little swatch on the paper as I start to apply it to whatever shape I'm painting. And everything I test it out really quickly before going ahead and applying it, spreading that paint out to a large area. You'll notice too on the ground, some of the shadows, their edges are quite soft. So the smallest block on the ground, that shadow has a really soft edge. And I applied that darker value when the paper was still wet so that those edges could again diffuse. Anywhere I want a crisp edge, such as the block I'm painting now, I really need to make sure all the edges surrounding it are dry. If they're dry, that paint will stay within that, that boundary of the shape. If they're wet, where the paint will then diffuse or spread. So I'm always kind of thinking about edges and having a variety of hard and soft edges, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a bit. I'm continuing to go in and reinforce the windowsill. This value I've just applied is slightly lighter, like a shade lighter than the one that was applied previously. I don't need a lot of contrast there. As I'm continuing to paint the ground, darkening the space, the negative space around the objects, you'll notice that it's like the objects just kind of come alive, they pop, that value contrast of light against dark all of a sudden does a whole lot to those objects in the foreground. Now I'm starting to address some of these tighter, smaller areas, shapes in between the objects, and realizing some little pockets that I completely missed in the first go round, and that can happen. So I'm going in and darkening things I think that need to be darkened a bit. I can make those adjustments. When painting a cylindrical object, such as the paper towel roll, I start by pre-wetting the space or that shape, keeping the water within the lines of the shape I wish to paint. The paint will travel wherever there is water, so if I wish to keep a wash contained in a certain area, I need to be sure the paper in the surrounding areas is dry, as I mentioned before. For this kind of gradual modeling of paint moving from a light value to a dark value, I'm starting with the middle value and then adding water for that wash then to diffuse into. Then I can go in and darken as needed, keeping in mind that wherever I want a soft edge, the paper needs to be moist, and with a sharper, crisper edge, the paper needs to be dry. And so in order to do that with right now I just painted the side edge of the paper towel roll, and now the top edge. I did want that kind of more gradual modeling, so I'm making sure that I'm working more wet into wet. At this point, I'll go back into some areas and darken them further and address shadows and add details as it makes sense. And when I feel like I've addressed all the value relationships in the painting and that there's enough contrast to the various edges throughout, I can call my painting exercise finished. So just some last, kind of touching up some areas, darkening some areas. Like in that cube, I noticed that two of the planes facing different directions were of equal value, and I wanted to make sure they were kind of distinct so that if they were the same value, the shape itself would look flatter. So making sure one's darker, one's lighter. And actually all three edges, or three planes of each of the cubes have a distinct value. And thanks for watching. I hope this has been helpful. If you have questions, please email me, and I'd be happy to answer them. Thanks. Bye-bye.